Hello, and welcome to Holistic Ambition, where we talk with visionary leaders who are redefining what it means to be ambitious. We cover ways you can live with more well-being, meaning, and fun in your career, business, and relationships. I'm your host, Stephanie Thoma, career coach for ambitious professionals and author of Confident Introvert. Today, we have Maggie with us. Maggie Gallant grew up in a small village in southeast England where she drank a lot of tea. But the beautiful countryside was wasted on her, and she escaped to London as soon as she could. Maggie fell into a career in corporate communications and then met Eric, an American in London. They married and moved to Austin, Texas in 2000. Reinventing herself led to a shortish career in stand-up comedy and writing a series of autobiographical solo shows. Maggie's afternoon tea business developed after years of hosting small tea parties with friends and a rapidly growing collection of china. Maggie is a lifelong learner, and years of studying historical modern etiquette led her now to offering etiquette tips, classes, and coaching. So we're going to dive in actually with the fact that this show doesn't have the customary segment. Thanks for being here. Thanks for having me. So what do you think about that, Maggie? Is that rude? Is that improper etiquette?
It's not rude, and you did, in fairness, alert me to that at the start, which is considerate of you. I think if you think about etiquette, the way that it was in sort of Emily Post's time, who is, probably the best known etiquette expert, it was all about consideration and respect for the feelings and thoughts of others. So we've created these conventions that do that, and that is just an example of one of those that's sort of almost an auto response. So if it's an auto response, is that really etiquette if it's just something that everybody does?
Yeah. So, when it comes to etiquette and it being automatic versus prescriptive, I usually think of etiquette. I mean, I'm not trained in this, but I think of it as sort of traditions where maybe there are nuances, but more or less it's sort of a script. Would you view it that way, or do you view it differently?
I mean, I think that's true, and I think that's part of the problem with the term etiquette, because it feels very old-fashioned, and people think it's all about how you set the table and if you know what a fish knife looks like, and those things aren't really important anymore. But you still go back to the fundamentals of it being about making other people feel comfortable, respecting them. And so etiquette still has a place. It's just the word is so loaded with this history that was traditionally, especially for us as women, it was something that would hold women in their place, and also a very classist structure too. So you have all that baggage with it. So that's part of, what I'm thinking about as I build this business. Do I still call it etiquette? Is it modern etiquette? Or do we try and find some other term for it? And right now I settle on it as modern etiquette because it still has a view to the past, but it's taking in the life that we're in now.
Yes. And on that vein, when it comes to there being a place for etiquette in modern society, how can etiquette be empowering to the person practicing it?
I mean, it's just, it's interesting because it's, like I said, it's not about setting the table correctly. It's about avoiding being discourteous, impolite, rude, offensive. And there's a whole discussion right now around civility. So whereas etiquette was very prescriptive, very rigid rules and conducts of behavior, I think now it evolves more to a point where you can have a conversation with someone who doesn't necessarily agree with your views, but you can use etiquette and civility to acknowledge each other's differences and make space for each other. And right now, this year, with an election, this is becoming more important than ever. And this is a lot of the work that I'm doing in companies, in organizations too.
Yes, this, with a lot of, let's say, politically charged conversations and things like that, being able to hold different viewpoints and allow people to feel welcome in expressing themselves. Do you advocate for having the conversations but approaching it with etiquette, or is etiquette simply having some off limits topics?
Well, I think there's a difference. So I talk about etiquette within this framework of creating a civil culture, or a civil workplace. So you don't want to have a workplace where people are false, where people won't engage in any kind of conversation, because you think about work, this is where we spend so much of our time with the same people. And if you narrow it down where nobody says anything, this is not a place that you want to be. So we encourage, and I mean, I literally use afternoon tea as the bridge for these conversations, because when you talk about, a lot of companies are bringing in etiquette training, but nobody particularly enjoys sitting in a room and watching an online video or having an instructor lecture them. I actually use some of the tools and the rituals around afternoon tea to show people's differences and show how you can actually work together. Plus, you get to enjoy some tea and some cakes and sandwiches at the same time, which does help. But joking aside, having something like that shows people's differences, especially culturally, and shares experiences and shares history, is really valuable to an understanding when those potential conflicts arise.
Yeah, and you mentioned joking aside, let's bring joking back. So when it comes to how comedy infuses your work, you have a background in stand-up comedy, and whereas some people may view at least traditional etiquette training as being a bit more stiff or maybe stuffy and not very approachable, can you tell us about your infusion of comedy?
Yeah, part of it just comes from being a Brit and growing up with a certain sense of humor and a self-deprecating sense of humor, where we don't take ourselves too seriously. And British humor and sarcasm and irony and all of those things, which I then used when I first started out in stand-up comedy, and then I use it in my training. Again, I can tell you exactly how to hold your cup. I can tell you how to pour your tea. I can tell you how to brew your tea. But there's just I think, an understanding that, you can know these rules, but you can play with them too once you understand them. It's the old thing about, once you know the rules, you can break them. So nothing is ever truly serious, but you come away from any kind of training or any kind of talk with a lot of information. It's just delivered in a way that maybe made you had fun. It's like, you remember when I don't know if you've ever done this, I don't know if people still do this, but you remember the old comedy driving schools, where if you got a ticket, you had to go and take your driving education class, but you could go and do the comedy version of that.
Oh, they didn't give me that version. It was very
Oh,
not funny. The version I had to do.
well, I did that when I was doing stand-up comedy. I did some of those comedy versions of the driving instruction. So you show all the same videos, you go through all the same points, but you make some jokes and infuse some humor along the way. And I believe people learn a lot better and they retain information a lot better doing that than in just a very dry style.
Yeah, even if the jokes are not that funny, I think if people are kind of ready to laugh and no one really wants to be there, but you have to be there, I can appreciate that. And when it comes to, so I have a couple questions. I'd love to hear a bit about your background and what led you to etiquette. But before, if you could, let's say, give one tip. So let's say that I'm holding my glass. Is there a tip for how you recommend holding a cup or anything related to that people can kind of take away right now, let's say the next time they go to a group dinner?
So I would say, and people may already know this, but if you're going to a networking event, for example, you always hold your drink in your left hand. Why do you do that?
So that you
So
can
Yeah, so you've always got your right hand free, and you're not also presenting, like if the glass had some ice in it or it's cold and you've got that sweaty sort of wet hand, like a wet fish to put
Mm.
out to somebody. And when you hold your wine glass, the convention is that you always hold it by the stem and not the bowl of the glass, because you don't want to heat up the wine. So I didn't know those things when I was younger. I did not know that. And I would do that thing where you go to shake hands and you have to sort of wipe it
Mm.
subtly on your clothes before you hand it out.
Yeah, see, those are some very, minute blunders that are easily avertable with these tips. So thank you for those. And I mean, yeah, I'm even thinking, yep, I've definitely done both of those things in the past. So when it comes to, yeah, your trajectory, were you always interested in etiquette? Was it something that became interesting over time? Was there an experience that catalyzed it?
I mean, I think growing up in England in a middle class family, we were always taught a certain way to behave. Like when you had tea, we always had serviettes, and we were told how to put them, or napkins would be the correct term, to put them in our lap, or to get down from the table after tea. I mean, I remember when I very, very young, I was probably 5 or 6, and we went to Betty's tea room, very famous tea room in Harrogate. And I was there with my brother, and a woman came over to my mother after we'd finished, and she said, "Oh, your children are, so beautifully behaved." And I always remembered that with a certain amount of pride, but also a certain amount of, well, we didn't do anything. Like we sat there and we didn't talk and we didn't make a noise and we didn't express ourselves anyway. So is that good etiquette, or is that more of a Victorian, children should be seen and not heard? And so growing up, going into a fairly formal career in corporate communications and PR and pitch meetings and board meetings, there's always a certain way that you're expected to behave. So I didn't study etiquette, but I think I was just always aware of it. And then after I moved here, I started becoming a lot more interested in the differences. And so I bought a lot of books on American etiquette etiquette experts here to sort of see how they differed. I mean, I remember my very, very first PR job. There's my boss, a woman called Donna Zurcher, and she was hosting the meeting with a new client, and she sat at the head of the table, and she was the most intimidating, scary boss. And I was quite young, and she said, "You're going to serve the tea." And she gave me no instructions other than that. She sort of gave me a bit of a flick of the finger to go and do it. And I got the tea, because we serve tea to clients, and I took it to her and I poured her tea first, and she hissed at me. She said, "Quiet first," as if I had made the most giant etiquette faux pas imaginable. I still remember the shame from that, but I hadn't been told. I didn't know. So
Yeah, so it sounds like those formative experiences, and you brought up an interesting point about expression and etiquette. And it sounds like you do sort of intermingle the two, where there's a consideration for other people's comfort. But yeah, can you speak more to, let's say, a difference in traditional etiquette versus this newer version that you're helping bring to light when it comes to personal expression, or maybe even talking about topics that traditionally would be taboo to speak about?
yeah, and I think it's a really interesting point, and my sort of thinking is evolving around it. But like I say, etiquette used to be these very fixed rules that, like that 5-year-old child in me, were very prescriptive and didn't allow for any quirks, any differences. You watch Bridgerton or any of these shows, and there are codes of behavior because that's what's expected for your trajectory to go marry into a wealthy family or whatever it may be. Now people want to, and I think this is particularly post-pandemic, people want to find their own ways to express themselves. And so you might go out to the theatre and you might be sitting next to somebody who loves this particular song in the musical and wants to sing along with it. So then what part of that is rude because it's impacting the people around you, but is there a place that there should be some level of personal expression because they're enjoying themselves? And are these old theatre traditions about sitting quietly and, you know, making no noise, is that just old fashioned and rigid? So it's very fluid right now. And I think as a society, both here and in England, we're seeing a lot of that develop. And that's where a lot of this tension is coming from, because they're going to extremes. You know, you'll go to a musical, or you're in a theatre and somebody's taking a phone call, or, you know, somebody is singing at the top of their voice, or there's a whole group of people who are in there. And that is offensive. That's offensive to other people who've spent money to be in the same place as you. But will we ultimately find some middle ground that allows for some of that expression? And the same in the workplace. Should it just be a place where politics or any other touchy subject, religion, are just not discussed at all? Or should this be a place where conversations can happen, but with the understanding of different views and empathy and all the other things that we've talked about? Does that make some sense?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sensing this fluidity, and certainly your experience moving to a new country and, you know, in your words, fitting in while standing out. Would it be correct that a lot of the expression piece is probably a bit more American in nature, stereotypically, and then the UK tends to be more reserved? So yeah, how was that relationship between fitting in while standing out, moving to America?
Right. Well, it's a great question, because, you know, when I moved 24 years ago, both countries were in a very different place, and come from a, you know, fairly insular country, still part of Europe at that time, but quieter. And I was, you know, quieter. I'm not a particularly outgoing person. And so moving and coming to Texas, it's a very big country, a very, very big state, rather. A lot of very big personalities. And so I came with the idea that I would just sort of slip in relatively unnoticed and then eventually find my way. Well, of course I wasn't. I was the ultimate fish out of water, because somebody moving state, which can also be a big transition, but if you're American, you know, you can blend in. You know, you might sound a little bit different, but for me, the minute I opened my mouth, I identified myself as other, as foreigner, and some people liked that and other people didn't. And I actually went to very early on, I went to the State Theatre here in Austin that offered classes, and I tried to take accent reduction classes. And I thought, well, maybe if I sound more American, then I might get jobs as an actor, or people just won't, every time I open my mouth, either tell me that I sound cute, or they glaze over and clearly haven't heard a word I said, because for a long time those were my two responses. And so I had to learn to adapt and to drop my T's so that I could order a bottle of water, as opposed to being totally confusing to people. And so I became this hybrid. And so now I'm an American citizen. I'm a very proud American citizen. But I'm also a British citizen, but I don't really truly fit in either place, and I don't think I ever will.
Yeah. So, I mean, interesting, because I feel like there can be this idea of not fitting in either place, or actually fitting in both places. Maybe not all of you, but, you know, certain aspects, certain sides. I know that certain stereotypes with, a British accent, some people can think, oh, it sounds charming, it sounds intellectual. So yeah, I'm curious when it comes to acclimating to the culture, if there was anything in particular, etiquette wise, let's say in America that was a little bit like, oh, that's kind of surprising that you acclimated to in particular.
I think it's things that I didn't notice as much here. Like I was always, I mean, we were brought up, most Brits are, to say please and thank you and may I have. I mean, that was just how we were brought up. We didn't even have to think about it. And so when I came here and people would say, can I get this? Or wouldn't use please, or wouldn't say thank you, or at the end of an email or a request, they would do the please and thank you. It was always quite shocking to me. And it still is now, because to me, those are fundamental. I mean, they're niceties, they're social graces. But they were odd. And I suppose in the same way, it's not so dissimilar to the, have a nice day here. It's just, it's something that we're trained to do. So I think when I came here, I mean, there's tons of examples. There's, everything from how you put your knife and fork on your plate at the end of a meal, or, how you switch hands when you're eating. I mean, very old fashioned. I do still use a knife and fork, but those things are so ingrained in me. So it was more the things that I noticed were missing, and having to make a decision whether I was going to adopt the same, or if I was going to keep my little eccentric piece of England in the 78704, which I think is ultimately what I have done. I still wear hats all the time. And people ask me if I'm going to a wedding or a church service, but these are nice things. Yeah, these are things I just take from my childhood.
Yeah, like to embrace your quirks, and it's not even like a quirk. It's just it's bringing a piece of your culture and how you identify with you. And something that you were talking about before recording that I wanted to bring back up is, in your words, the erosion of manners, and where that comes from, what that means, why it's happening.
I think it goes back to a little bit of what I was saying about asserting your own individuality. And it's, people don't want to feel old-fashioned. Society moves forward, and so a lot of the old rules get left behind, and worrying over whether you can correctly identify a fish fork or a fish knife does not matter. And so we've dropped a lot of those things, which is great. And we've dropped, the restrictions and the behaviors that are expected of women, and that inability, by setting these high level etiquette rules, that people who are lower down are not able to move up. I mean, that's why they were originally created, to keep the upper classes and the aristocracy at their level. So we've shed a lot of that, but I think we've also, along with that, shed those elements that show respect and courtesy and politeness for one another. And whether we blame, the pandemic for some of that, I don't know. It's sort of an easy blame, but I know a lot of companies that I go into say that there's obviously been a massive change in the way that people treat their workspace and their co-workers since the pandemic, especially if they're hybrid working. So I think we've lost some things, and we are seeing that. And when we see other people do it, do you want to be the one that is proverbially the doormat that everybody walks over because you're too soft and you're too nice, and you're saying, oh, I'm sorry and please and thank you? Do you hold your own in that situation, or do you become like everybody else?
Interesting. Yeah. And actually, this sparked something for me, and I wonder if other listeners will identify with this, but even pop music that kids listen to, that parents bring their kids to these concerts, they have cuss words in them now. And when I was a kid, that would not have flown, for lack of a better word. And it's just kind of amazing to me how normalized, the F word is just like radio. Like I feel
Right.
like it's everywhere now on YouTube, in concerts with really high profile people. And yeah, I wonder, when it comes to the evolution of language and which words are, bad and wrong versus, just words that people can use, of all ages, all social
Hmm.
classes. What's your take on that?
It's a really interesting question because, yeah, I grew up with some of that. I mean, we didn't, use those kinds of words in the house, but in England, when I was growing up, we had the watershed on television, which meant after 9 o'clock, a lot of things would fly that wouldn't fly
Mhm.
before 9 o'clock. It was obviously designed to to protect children. Um, but I see the same, and I think part of it, when we were younger, that those kinds of words were shock value, and that's why we used them, and that was just being different to our parents' generation. But now, like you say, the parents are kind of, we're okay with this, and is it part of the, you should let kids express themselves however they want? I mean, this freedom of expression, when you are asking me about the differences in coming here, that's probably one of the bigger things. This, you are much freer here to say what you want. And I would often say to Eric, my husband, why can they say that? And because that's part of the framework of the country. And so in England, because it's such a small, relatively small country, an island, we've grown up with this whole, Blitz spirit and Churchill getting us through the war together, and we'll allow the deprivations and the sacrifices for the greater good. And I think in that country and here, I'm not sure that doing things for the greater good is as strong as it used to be. So, and I'm sorry, I got slightly off your question, but yeah, I see that too, and I'm not sure particularly what to say about it, but I do think that it's a trend that's going to continue because, again, do you want to be the kid, or do you want to be the parent that stands up and says, no, you can't do this, or it's the cell phone argument, no, I'm not going to allow my kid to do this. Well, then what's the impact going to be on your kid? Are you just doing it for you without thinking about the impact on your child? I don't know. I don't have children. I don't have to go through any of those minefields, which I'm kind of happy about these days.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting with the generations how norms are shifting. And, when it comes to you starting your business and defining your brand, and your words, starting a business later in life, what is that
Mm-hmm.
experience like? And what have been some things that have really stood out to you in that journey?
I think that, as I was saying earlier, a lot of the experiences, it's very easy if you haven't had a career for, a single career for, 20, 30 years, which has totally changed. That is not the norm these days. But if you've jumped around a lot, it's easy to sort of say, well, I never really followed any one particular thing, and I fell into that trap for a while. Now with my own business, I look back and I say, well, starting right from the very earliest days, all of those experiences, all of those things I've tried have led me to create this business. From going back and being a child in my little English village and going around to the old ladies in the village, I would do their grocery shopping for them, and I would have tea with them. And I loved the experience. And I learned to brew tea, and I learned to try different teas, and I learned to bake scones. And here I am brewing tea, telling people how to brew tea, making scones. There's this lovely thread, and it's not linear, but there's a progress. But of course, I could say, well, I could have done this 10 years ago, and I'd maybe have a longer time doing it. But I believe I started it at the right time for how I feel about it, for the level of stress that I don't have about it, that 10 years ago I might have been a lot more anxious or in a different position of being able to create this. So.
Right. And you're speaking to the energy behind creation. And when you feel in alignment with what you're bringing to light versus when you feel, they say start before you're ready. And I think there's, that can work in some regards, and it can be self-sabotage in others, depending on the level of resistance or lack of inspiration that actually exists in that moment. So yeah, no, I think that those are really great points that you bring up. And when, yeah, so I'm curious if there's anything else that you'd want to add that we haven't yet covered when it comes to this new chapter. And actually, I love that you brought up this full circle moment of something that you loved as a kid that you're actually living right now, just the poetry in that.
Right. And I think, it's that thing of, when you look at yourself now, life is about being bold. Life is about making bold choices. For me, anyway, that's always what I've wanted to do. And so I look back. So I look at the 5-year-old Maggie sitting in that tea room, taking tea, but not doing anything that would draw attention to myself. And then I think about 95-year-old Maggie, and what's she going to look back on and think about in this period? Like, did I start it at the right time? Did I do it for long enough? And so I look at those both ends of that spectrum, and that in between periods, which is where I am now. I think it's a really exciting time, and I think more people hopefully would, should, could do that. You don't just have to look at yourself in this one moment of time. You look at your 5-year-old self and what they would think, and you look at your 95-year-old self looking back, and hopefully at both ends there is some pride and there's some amazement and there's some joy in it. And I think I now, after 24 years in a country that I believe has given me far greater opportunities than I would ever have had in England, it's pretty great. Sorry, getting a bit non-British emotional here about that.
That's good. That's awesome. Everything's welcome on this show. And, I'm curious how you define ambition.
So I think, oh gosh, it's such a great question. I was trying to think about this because, I grew up in the, so I'm answering the question with a longer point, but I started my career in the 80s. And so I don't know if people listening to this will even remember Wall Street, the film, and Michael Douglas, and Greed is Good, and Power Suits and Big Shoulders. That's, that was ambition. And what was ambition? Ambition was about money and working hard and things and material possessions. Work-life balance didn't exist. And so now ambition is really what I was saying. Like, are you, am I fulfilled? Do I look back with a sense that everything has led me to this? And of course, there's a financial aspect and there's a work-life balance. So it's everything that you talk about. It's holistic. It's full. It's rounded. It encompasses all of these different aspects, and it's not hard.
Yeah, so it's not hard. So when it comes to what holistic ambition means to you, let's say in a phrase, what would that look like?
So for me, I think it's letting everything be okay. It's stop swimming upstream. You know,
Mm.
it's turn your kayak around and go with the flow. That has been so life changing for me, that philosophy, when you just loosen the grip. And so you do things without, you still take action, but you do it without expecting this singular outcome. You just keep doing and you just keep doing, and you know there's an innate sense of well-being that those things that you're looking for will come. And that is a very non-British perspective.
I mean, hey, it sounds like you're a fusion of both cultures now.
I guess I really am.
Yeah, no, but I feel like no matter the culture, there's always room for, an element of heart. And I think that you've shared that with us today. So, regardless of where you're from, I feel like you did a really beautiful job of sharing that. And for those that want to learn more about you, stay connected with your work, how can they find you?
So my website is trulyterrifictea.co. I am on Instagram at trulyterrifictea, and I post a lot of videos with a lot of etiquette advice, talk about different aspects of British culture, what's a scone and what's a crumpet and what's a cream tea. So lots of advice on there. And then I'm also on LinkedIn on the business side, at Maggie Gallant on LinkedIn.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Maggie. And thank you at home for watching. Go ahead and subscribe to be the first to know of the next Holistic Ambition speaker in our series. Wishing you a wonderful day. Until next time.